Robert Spies, you're next, if you'd come up, please. Robert, I forgot your title here, but Robert was in charge of the science kind of during and after the spill as it relates to the damage assessment. And we've asked him to come and kind of give us a review there, and we'll go from there. Robert?
Thank you. Thanks, Dave, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me to participate. And Nancy, thank you for putting this forum on. I think it's particularly useful 25 years after the Exxon Valdez last March, and about coming up on 5 years from the Deepwater horizon. I am not a response person. I was the chief scientist for the Exxon Valdez Trustee Council. I actually did not arrive in Prince William Sound until the last day of this cleanup in 1989 in October. So, and my expertise is as an effects expert. So I do have a few observations and opinions on response, and but caveat emptor, beware the buyer beware. So what I would like to do this morning is talk about the history of EVOS and the scientific effort confronting uncertainty in spill science. I think it's a key concept in trying to understand the effects of oil spills. Talk a little bit about the early toll, and then talk about the early years in this kind of a long monitoring effort of recovery and restoration from 1989 to 1994, and then the later years from 1994 to 2002, and particularly the interaction of the science and the policy and what the scientific program is like, and then try to put the spill in context of other major perturbations in the marine environment, and as Gary Shigenaka referred to, some of the long-term changes that occur in these ecosystems, and finally some of the lessons learned from the standpoint of effects. I look at the Exxon Valdez as a black swan, a metaphor and a real tragedy. A black swan in the sense that this was something that wasn't supposed to happen, or it had a very, very, very low probability. A metaphor for the time in our history of environmental awareness when this whole spill became kind of a representative of our dependence on oil and the environmental consequences of it, and then a real tragedy. And there were effects, and they lasted for quite a while, as best as we can tell. So I'll try to answer several questions. What happened in April 1989, in March and April 1989 in Prince William Sound and the Gulf of Alaska? Also, what happened in Valdez, Cordova, and Anchorage, and Juneau within the state of Alaska, Houston, Texas, where Exxon Corporation is headquartered, and Washington, D.C., because the federal government had a huge role to play in this spill as well. And what was the context? How bad was it in comparison to the 1964 earthquake, which happened on Good Friday 25 years previous to the Exxon Valdez, and the Exxon Valdez happened again on Good Friday. Interesting kind of coincidence. And what might be the lessons for the Arctic, at least in general terms? I'm not going to talk a lot about the early history of the spill. I think we've got it covered in the first couple of talks this morning. But there was a 3-year cleanup effort after this spill. There's a small amount of oil that remains in the beaches yet, and there's evidence for about a 15 to 20-year effect of the spill on the ecosystem of Prince William Sound and the northern Gulf of Alaska. So why did this happen? The proximate causes have to do with the Trans-Alaska pipeline terminating in Valdez. We had the ship's captain who was imbibing at the local pizza parlor in Valdez before I got on the ship, and some things went wrong, which you've just heard about. And the oil, instead of going to Long Beach, California, to be refined and used in the freeways of California, where I live, ended up floating on the surface of the Gulf of Alaska. In addition, there were, on a kind of a deeper level, the risk assessments that were done indicated that maybe a spill like this might happen once in 200 years. And obviously, having that spill happen 10 years after the oil started flowing in the Trans-Alaska pipeline certainly seemed to contradict that prediction. At least it was an extremely low probability of that happening that soon. Cleanup equipment was not available. There was a lack of tugs and radar, and it kind of added up to complacency and a lack of preparation. We've already seen this slide on the spill originated in the Gulf of, originated in Prince William Sound and spread through the Gulf of Alaska. Here's a shot of the intertidal in Green Island, or some of the oil in a form of a moose coming ashore. And of course, there's always the emphasis on doing something about the spill. And there was a huge cleanup effort, as we've heard about. This is probably a good thing in most cases, but then there was this application of hot water washing in some parts of Prince William Sound where the oil was particularly problematic, that resulted in a long-term ecological damage to the intertidal that probably would have been less if there had been that sort of application. The scientific studies which I'll be talking about mostly this morning started immediately at the time of the spill. The people on NOAA vessels were out ahead of the spill before it hit the beach, actually, and gathered some extremely valuable samples in terms of baseline. Baseline is always a challenge in these things in terms of what was the status of the ecosystem before the oil hits. And we usually don't have that kind of information. In Prince William Sound, we did get some baseline data, but there was a lot of things that weren't known about the status of the ecosystem. There weren't any, for instance, any quantitative intertidal studies of the communities there, and we had to rely, rather than before and after kinds of more reliable data, we had to rely on contrasting oil areas versus unoiled areas, which has its own intellectual problems. So there were about 40 different studies that took place in 1989, and hundreds of studies over the next 20 years. I think this is the amount of money spent on the science at the time probably influenced some of the measures that were in OPA 90. I think that some of the people that put that legislation together thought that it was rather excessive. I think if you look at the amount spent just on understanding what happened to the spill, I think there's an argument to be made that spending a good proportion or a good multiplier of the amount of money spent by the National Science Foundation on ocean science at the time, you perhaps might accept that argument, but I will say that we really pushed forward our understanding of the ecology of the Gulf of Alaska substantially. And I know, at least for pink salmon, what was known about how to manage pink salmon was advanced probably by 20 years by some experts' opinions. So there was a silver lining, if you will, to the extensive scientific effort. There were about 300 publications at the time I left off, back in 2002, and more now from the Exxon Valdez studies of the Trustee Council. And then the Exxon-sponsored scientists had almost as many. And this brings up the whole thing about two scientific camps, which I think was a rude awakening for people, including myself. There are a lot of my colleagues that, like Jerry Neff and Paul Bohm, that went to work for Exxon. And then there are a lot of scientists that I knew that were working from the government side diverged very sharply in their views about the impacts of the study. And I think it was confusing to a lot of policymakers and confusing to the public. And why did this happen? In general terms, I think there's some different explanations. One is that there's different definitions of injury that were used by the government and by Exxon, different standards of proof, different frame of reference, particularly geographically, and different power, statistical power of the studies to show effects. I'd like to give an example of this controversy. It has to do with juvenile pink salmon in 1989, and I think you could sum up Exxon's position in this little Latin phrase here: one thing following another is not proof of cause and effect, where the government said, well, that's not necessarily a reason to deny a relationship, and the government used a weight of evidence approach as opposed to a cause and effect chain from the spilled oil all the way to the injury, with every arrow firmly established. Let me show you what this pink salmon controversy was about. This is from our book that we wrote on the Gulf of Alaska ecological changes. It's the life history of the pink salmon. They start off spawning in July and August, as they do every year. You can see number one on the map in these very short, cold streams that move into Prince William Sound. They usually spawn in the mouth of the streams. They overwinter for 6 or 7 months until the next spring. In March and April, as alevins, they're washed out into the salt water down these short streams. Some of them some of these eggs are laid in areas just very adjacent to the ocean. And they're 40, 50 millimeters when they reach the salt water, and grow rather quickly through about 60 millimeters, and gradually move down along the shoreline, in this case of Prince William Sound, and out into the Gulf of Alaska for about 11 months, and then they return. So they've got a 2-year life cycle, the shortest of any of the Pacific salmon species. But this growth period in boxes 2, 3, and 4, up through 60 millimeters, the speed of that growth, which varies depending on the amount of food that's available, and also what's happening with the predators is very important there, can be affected by oil. And we had pretty good evidence for this. There was 2 studies that went on in '89, and again repeated in 1990, where both of the '89 studies showed that the wild fry that were recovered from the oiled areas grew less than those from the reference areas. However, these were fry that were collected out in the open sound, and Exxon said, well, we don't know where all those fry were. We don't know that the oiled ones were there all the time. There could have been in unoiled areas and vice versa, so we don't accept that. And you know, we had biomarkers of pink salmon. This is an enzyme called P450-1A that gets induced by exposure to petroleum hydrocarbons. And this is a longitudinal section through a pink salmon embryo, and this little square up towards the upper left-hand corner in the blow-up down in the lower right-hand corner shows this red staining of this enzyme. So we had the enzymes in the larvae and the young out in the sound, which went away the next year. Plus we had the growth. And then we had laboratory experiments showing that the growth is reduced by oil and food, because particulate oil was a source of exposure to the pink salmon. And despite all these things, there are numerous papers that are authored showing these peer-reviewed papers that are were accepted in first-rate journals showing these kinds of effects, and we had as many peer-reviewed papers probably by the scientists from Exxon sponsored studies that denied these relationships and found reasons to see the studies as incomplete. So let's talk a little bit about the immediate spill toll, excuse me. And in 1989, the best we could tell, there was about 2,000 sea otters killed, probably 200 to 300 harbor seals based on before and after surveys of the harbor seal rookeries in Prince William Sound. Killer whales, I always put a question mark against this because they were accepted as a trustee council, but I've always had a problem with accepting the killer whales as being victims of the spill, but I can't prove my point either, so it's a source of controversy. There's a lot of unknowns about the exposure to the killer whales and what ended up on some of the beaches and sunk in the Sound. Certainly AB pod, which was the main affected pod, there was others, had bullet holes in them from previous encounters with fishermen. So whether somebody took advantage of the confusion during the spill to kill off a couple more members of the pod is a question, I think. There were about, depending on how you estimate it, something between 150 and 250,000 seabirds killed. Gulf of Alaska is a particularly rich environment for seabirds, and they make their living by diving through the surface of the water. Some of them have to paddle around on the surface of the water, and of course they're usually the first victims, even before the intertidal area gets affected. Probably 200 to 300 bald eagles. I talked a little bit about the early life stages of pink salmon, and there was also herring affected. They spawn intertidally, and they spawned just shortly after the spill occurred in the spring of 1989. And their embryos were damaged. There was the 1989 year class was the smallest of the herring year classes in quite some time. Again, you're dealing with natural variability here, so whether that was wholly or partly or not at all due to the oil is, I think, an open question. And there was about 1,500 meters of intertidal habitat. So talking about what happened generally in the science program and what happened with policy in the early years, 1989 through 1994, the science is mainly focused on assessment of damage, how many of each species was killed. I convened workshops on pink salmon, sea otters, sockeye salmon, murres, killer whales, harbor seals, all for the purposes of litigation, trying to get the best experts in the country and sometimes from overseas to look at the evidence we had and to look at the studies that were done and to make recommendations as to what should be done next or what was missing and how we would strengthen those studies to find out what happened. And that eventually kind of ended up developing into a fairly robust peer review process. The economic studies were done in secret. Formulation of a restoration program. I know I would occasionally get phone calls at odd hours from economists at some meeting that needed to have a question answered about what was happening with the resources. But the economists eventually made their findings available to the legal team and I think helped drive the settlement that happened in 1990. No publications, which the whole process was criticized for because of the litigation. They were being held tight as they are in the BP spill currently. All those are beginning to come out in publication. And there were failures in the fisheries. In 1992 and 93, the pink salmon took quite a drop in returning adults. And also in 1993 and 94, there was a big crash of the herring in Prince William Sound where the estimated biomass dropped from about 120,000 metric tons to less than 20,000. On the policy side, the trustee council, which was in charge of administering the whole government effort, made most of the decisions. They were represented on a day-to-day basis by what was called the management team, which kind of more or less administered the damage assessment and then later on the restoration program. There was an early settlement with Exxon for about $1 billion, which seemed like a lot of money at the time, but compared to what's happening these days with BP, it seems rather minor. And then the peer reviewers were really on the sidelines after the settlement in 1990. They had a very important influence early on because of the legal mandates and needs, but after 1990, after the settlement, they were kind of on the sideline. And then there was an injured species list that was being put together by the trustee council, which drove Exxon nuts. In the later years, on the policy side, Wally Hickel became governor and appointed Charlie Cole as Attorney General, and the state was, I think, probably had a little larger role at this time, and Charlie was very interested. He served on a trustee council, and he appointed an executive director to take over from the head of the management team, and that executive director, Jim Ayers, is here at this conference. There was a lot more reliance on peer review and a lot more reliance on publication. And then because of the fishery failures in 1993 and 94, there was a Valdez blockade. The fishermen lined up their vessels across Prince William Sound to keep the tankers from moving in and out of the port because they were frustrated with the problems with the fisheries, and they were being affected greatly by the economics. The wholesale price of pink salmon had dropped from over 20 cents a pound to about 6 cents a pound during this period, and there was a lot of hardship in the fishing community. On the science side, the question began to surface of why aren't some of these species recovering that we expected, and why are we seeing these fisheries collapses? And in answer to the blockade, Governor Hickel promised the people of Cordova and fishermen in Prince William Sound that some large ecosystem studies would be initiated, and under the guidance of the executive director, Jim Ayers, that we started to assemble some of the proposals for carrying out these large ecosystem studies. It started with the Sound Ecosystem Assessment, moved on to the Nearshore Vertebrate Predator Project, and then the Apex Predator Project also, and they were all related to how the system functioned ecologically and what was going on that we could understand in terms of why weren't some of these species recovering and why were these fisheries in such trouble. These ecosystem studies brought a lot of integrative science to bear, and I think had a real salutary effect on interagency cooperation in terms of understanding these ecosystems, which they're all charged at looking at some aspect of. And so the marine mammal people and the fisheries people were talking more with each other and with physical oceanographers and so forth. And we had rounds of reviews on these proposals, which drove a lot of integration. And it was, I think, a great development in the scientific program. And then there was emphasis in the later years. I left the process in 2002. Won't talk much about what happened after that. But there was emphasis in the later years in Gulf ecosystem monitoring. We had what's called the GEM program in place. And it was being put together in 2000, 2001. And the idea was to use some of the funds from the settlement with Exxon and to keep those in some kind of a account that would allow us to do some perpetual monitoring of the system so that we would have a better idea of what was happening with natural resources in the Gulf of Alaska. Unfortunately, the Governor Murkowski, when he took over, was really greatly opposed to what happened, particularly with the trustees' purchase of land in Alaska and turning over the land to government management. And he proceeded through his appointees to dismantle the Gulf Ecosystem Monitoring Program. It does survive now in a somewhat reduced form, and there's some really good things going on right now, particularly with regard to herring and long-term changes in that ecosystem. How bad was this spill? To provide a little context, there was these two other large things that happened in the Gulf of Alaska that were touched on in earlier talks. The first was this 1964 earthquake, and it had some kind of eerily similar effects on a very 10,000-foot level to the spill. It had affected a similar geographic area from the middle of Prince William Sound down past Kodiak Island. There's a big block of earth crust that got tilted up. So that was about the same area as the oil spill. They both happened in the springtime. I already mentioned they both happened on Good Friday, if you're superstitious. Luckily, last Good Friday, the next 25 years, nothing happened that we know of. There was a big impact on the intertidal zone. All this uplifting during the earthquake exposed intertidal communities and then sunk other communities. So there was a big effect on, there was a fellow named Stoner Haven who was doing his PhD at Berkeley at the time. He was looking at some of the intertidal communities, but there was nothing like the kind of response that we had looking at, and Gary Shiganaka was involved in these studies, looking at the intertidal communities after the spill. So we can't really say too much about the time of recovery of those resources, but for generally in resources, maybe 25 years is a reasonable recovery. The pink salmon were greatly affected by the earthquake, and they came back eventually pretty strongly. And after the spill, there probably wasn't much evidence after about 1994 for the, but we do have species such as the sea otter, harlequin ducks, and a few other species, and still the killer whales, if you accept that damage, that took at least 25 years, and the killer whales, the AB pod at least, and the AT pod, which is a transient pod, still haven't gone back to where they were before the spill. Another thing to compare the spill to was the long-term climate change that has occurred and that is occurring in the Gulf of Alaska. And there's also these decadal changes that have taken place that might give us some clue as to what long-term climate change might do. There was this large shift in the Pacific Decadal Oscillation in the 1970s. This regime shift had an extensive effect on the communities through the northern Gulf of Alaska shelf. We get a lot warmer water. It allowed the cod to get up onto the shelf and feed during the wintertime, feed on the crustaceans. And we went from a crustacean-dominated system pre-70s, was a lot of shrimp and crab available to the fishermen, to a fish-dominated in a relatively short time. And that was really well established by a trawling program that the Alaska Department of Fish and Game had in place for another reason. And it kind of shows you, I think, and I remember talking to Alan Mearns back in the 70s when I got back from Australia, and he took me out And to the hallway next to his office, he had a sheet of paper that was 25 feet long. He said, well, you know, people have been going down to the end of the Scripps Pier every day at noontime, dipping a bucket of seawater out and putting a thermometer in it. And something's going on here. The water's getting warmer. And so sometimes when you have these data gathering things in place for long terms, they serve a lot of different purposes, and you're glad you had them. So anyhow, just to get back to the climate change, we saw these extensive changes on a shelf. That may give you some idea of what may have happened. And I think that the oil spill effects, as tragic as they were, and are probably nothing compared to what we might see with long-term climate change in terms of ecological changes.
All right, we're about at time, so.
Okay, let me just quickly go through some of the lessons learned. First of all, I think there's this kind of the silver lining. There's a lot of value in ecosystem studies and understanding perturbations and focusing not just on what was obviously injured, but trying to understand the larger context under which these injured populations are struggling, I think is probably a much better approach. Not cheap, though. The thorough understanding of injuries is necessary. We saw some emerging injuries during the spill, which I don't have time to talk about. There's long-term dividends of ecosystem studies. I talked about that already. The ecosystem studies involving public agencies do produce some synthetic advantages of these resource agencies, which often tend to work in isolation, brings them together. So that was, I think, a good outcome. And dealing with uncertainty logically and in an enlightened way is key to moving towards good policy decisions. And strong peer review is necessary to make adaptive management work and restorations. I don't have time to talk about my views on the Arctic and Arctic drilling, but I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Bob. So now we'll have our panel come up, if you would. And the panel, as you've already heard, Larry Dietrick, Director of Spill Prevention and Response, Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. Robert Mastracchio, Vice President for Engineering, Exxon Mobil Research and Engineering Company. And Marilyn Hyman, Director, U.S. Arctic Program, Pew Charitable Trust. So, Larry, you're up first. Take it away.
Great. Thank you, David. And thank you to Kathy and Nancy for putting the forum together. We appreciate all the work that's been done here at the University of New Hampshire and look forward to getting more products out and knowledge from you all in the future. I was originally told there might be a lot of students here, and therefore they would have been 0 to 5 years old when the Exxon Valdez occurred. And then we found out earlier that there's some older people who may not remember what went on for other reasons. But there's quite a few people that stood up. Okay, I'm with the state of Alaska. I've been with them for quite some time, from TAPS construction right up to about a year ago, and was involved with the oil spill programs and state prevention and response measures through that period of time. So I've been asked to go over the state's viewpoint perspective on the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and I'm going to focus on the initial response, which is what was a key item for the state in determining what was going on. Okay, so just some quick bullets here on the Alaska background to give you some perspective on where the state was. It wasn't that long since statehood where the big oil discovery occurred, a 20 billion barrel oil field, very big deal in many ways for the state. The state is an owner state. You've probably heard that. It owns its resources, it sells them, and it has also has a duty to protect world-class resources all across the state. So it's got an interesting dual role. The Manhattan, which I think Ed made reference to, was one of the early tests to see if you could get the oil off the North Slope through crude oil tankers. It was the largest ice-breaking crude oil tanker ever built. It went from the East Coast to the North Slope, picked up a barrel of oil, turned around, went back, and they based on those studies, determined that the pipeline was necessary to go to an ice-free port. In reaction to all of these things, the state then started gearing up then for their role they would play in the oil era that was coming upon them. So in '71, they actually created the Department of Environmental Conservation and passed oil spill statutes. And that was in preparation for oil production, transportation, and storage from the new oil era. '72, the final environmental impact statement. Construction on TAP started in '74. And in '76, the state was not happy or satisfied or comfortable that the national and international regulatory regimes governing tankers that would be applying Prince William Sound waters were adequate. Neither was the state of Washington, who was on the receiving end of most of these tankers. So the state actually passed what they called the tanker safety law at that time. And it was kind of a backdoor way to assess risk charges on tankers as an incentive to get them to go to double hulls and include best available technology, redundant propulsion, and other safety features on vessels. So this is something that the state tried to do back in the '70s in anticipation of what they thought were reasonable protection measures for their resources. The law was challenged. It was ultimately thrown out in Chevron versus Hammond. And so double hulls did not come online as a rate of that state attempt to do that. There was also escorts involved with what the state was trying to do at that time. TAP started flowing in '77, and in '89, at the time of the spill, the North Slope oil field was producing 25% of the domestic crude oil production in the United States. So the point here, the message from this is that Alaska was very proactive in trying to set up a regulatory regime that included oil spill contingency plan, which is a very rare thing for a state to be taken on. There's only a handful of states that have that. They had financial responsibility, and they tried to up the requirements, so to speak. This slide is to give those who may not be familiar with the size of the ocean area in Alaska. This is the 200-mile EEZ, and it shows it for the lower 48, the islands, and Alaska. So clearly, Alaska's responsibilities, the remoteness, the logistics are daunting. I think Ed covered a lot of this with the vessels and stuff we're going through. It's a huge responsibility. It's logistically tough as anything. I think Prince William Sound roughly compares, I was looking at the East Coast, to about Chesapeake Bay in terms of the focused down area that's shown in the rectangle there with the Prince William Sound area. So it's very remote. Any response depends on weather and complex logistics, and cascading resources in from other areas is not really very helpful, or at least timely to get there in time. Okay, so the incident. Exxon Valdez occurred, about 11 million gallons spilled. It all came out within about like a 24-hour period. So it was like a one-shot, rapid release. It was well-charted water. So a look at the contingency plans then that were in place at that time. The operable contingency plan that was in place was the Alyeska oil spill contingency plan. That was a state-required plan. That was a result of the state laws that were passed in the '70s, okay, to require oil spill contingency plans from facilities and tankers. The law that was passed said that you can't operate a marine terminal without an approved contingency plan. And the contingency plan then attempted then to require what was necessary to respond to a spill from the terminal or any of the tankers. That was the approved plan that was in place at the time. Exxon also had a plan, but it was not specific to Prince William Sound. There was no federal plan review or approval required at the time. And the National Regional Contingency Plans, I think you're all aware of, come at it from a government perspective and really don't have with it the trained personnel, equipment, or response resources to respond to a specific scenario. I would also note that the Prince William Sound dispersant guidelines had just been approved on early March, right before the spill. This is the Prince William Sound area here, and there's a 3-day window that the state ultimately concluded was a critical time frame for this. The state puts prevention on top, as I think does everybody. And so the state had a whole separate effort going on prevention measures. Their second priority, though, is to contain the oil at the source. So stop the source, whether it's plugging a leak on a boat or stopping a blowout. Stopping the oil at the source is the most important next thing to do. And the third thing then is, if you can't get that source stopped or if it's already released, is to contain the spill immediately. And as other speakers have said, Ed made the point, the longer it goes, the farther it goes, you're a losing battle. So the third priority then is to get a hold of it as quickly as possible. This teardrop on here shows approximately the area of the slick at the end of day 3 of the spill. It was pretty much still in a whole slick. It was pretty thick oil for the most part. It was very amenable to attacking with all 3 response tools. Another reason this is important in terms of the containment and control and the need to rapidly do that is the nature of this water body here. Prince William Sound is not an offshore open ocean situation. Prince William Sound is a very pristine, highly valuable resource area. So even though this is a big area and you have tanker lanes through it, you don't have much time if you're going to have an event where you're going to impact shorelines. You just don't. You have to react, and you have to react right now, which is one of the reasons why the state puts a high priority on that. So what were the recovery conditions? Well, I already mentioned it was a rapid release. Good weather prevailed, and the slick remained largely intact for 3 days. It was basically, the edge of that teardrop was about 16 miles from the source. On the evening of day 3, high winds broke up the slick, extending it to 37 miles. And after that, it was pretty much a losing battle in terms of spread and distribution of the oil. It went on its own, out of control. The other thing is the type of oil. The North Slope crude oil emulsifies. And after the storm, emulsification was a major issue for the cleanup. And it very much reduced the effectiveness of in situ burning, dispersants, and mechanical. The North Slope crude, by the way, is quite a bit different than the Gulf oil. And so that's a very important thing to take into account. So here's a summary of the initial response actions for the first 3 days. In situ burning, okay? In situ burning requires a permit. It's basically regulated by the Clean Air Act. Okay, you can't send emissions into the air unless they're in compliance with the Clean Air Act. If you're a state and you have primacy for the Clean Air Act from EPA, then you're the one that writes the permit. And a permit is required, therefore, to conduct ISBs. ISB, though, in Alaska was pioneered, it's my impression, was pioneered in Alaska way back in the 80s. And it was pioneered as a cleanup tool for broken ice on the North Slope. So there was a great body of knowledge about burning and its ability to be successful at the time this occurred. But at the time that occurred, the RRT met the first day at noon, discussed both dispersants and burning, gave their thumbs up to both of them. However, there were no igniters, no booms, no gear in Valdez. Had to be brought in from someplace else. The burn that was conducted wasn't conducted until Saturday. It was after dark, and the command didn't find out about it until the village of Representative Dietrick called and said, "Hey, what are you burning over there?" Because the plume went over them. The whole intent of the Clean Air Act is to protect the public health from those emissions. The other thing is, how much would you need to really burn up an appreciable amount? It would take a lot. I think that clearly the Deepwater Horizon was a highly successful example. 400 burns spanning 90 days and thousands of feet of fireproof boom. Work textbook. Up here, we had one burn. It in itself was successful, but after day 3 it was. There was no other attempts to burn in the first 3 days. Mechanical, you can see it there. 3 skimmers. The barge was late. The barge was not certified to carry oil. There was 3 skimmers on day 1. They collected about 210 barrels. Day 3, they had about 5 skimmers. Total amount mechanically recovered in the first 3 days was about 3,000, less than 0.1%. There was no airborne support for the mechanical to place the skimmers in the oil. no containment of the leading edge, minimal recovery, no repair capabilities, no storage, no transfers. It pretty much didn't happen. The third tool, the dispersants. Again, the dispersant use is governed by the National Contingency Plan. Alaska was ahead of the curve on dispersants. It just approved pre-authorization for dispersant guidelines in early March. That was in play at the time the spill occurred. It basically consists of Zone 1, 2, and 3. Zone 3 are nearshore areas, sensitive habitats, which is a no-go. Zone 2 is a discretionary with the concurrence of the RT, and Zone 1 is pre-approved. You can go for it. The entire slick for the first 3 days was basically in a Zone 1. There was a little bit of it in a Zone 2 by the vessel itself. So there were no problems with approvals, okay, in using any of these tools. There were 4 dispersant applications in these 3 days. The first one was not until the evening of the first day. It was a helo bucket because that's all they could muster, a 300-gallon dump in the evening. And the results were inconclusive. The oil was thick. The visibility was bad because it was evening. The second one took place, so FOSC says, give her a go again. Well, there were no fixed wings in Valdez on day 1. First fixed wing didn't arrive till day 2. They didn't get it mobilized till the afternoon. The second fixed wing finally got out there on day 2, and it was also declared inconclusive. FOSC says, keep trying. Next event occurred on day 3 in the morning. The DC-6 that came out of British Columbia came up. It had a malfunctioning spray system. So that one didn't work. They followed it up then in the afternoon with the C-130. It was a consensus that was successful, and they geared up then to start continuing that on day 4. The problem is day 4, the storm hit on the night of day 3. And it had a major effect on burning, had a major effect on mechanical, major effect on dispersants. There was an attempt on day 5 to burn at Eleanor Island. It couldn't get ignition because of the emulsification, and there were several follow-up attempts to do dispersants. To do dispersants, to take care of a spill like that, would require about 400,000 gallons, roughly, of dispersants at a 20-to-1 treat ratio. There was 4,000 gallons in Valdez when the spill occurred. So the equipment, the capabilities were in no way there to put a dent in any way, shape, or form to this spill. And the approvals were certainly not an issue. So what were the lessons learned? The reason this initial response is important is because it became the focus of the state's concern. The state felt, well, we wanted more requirements. We wrote a contingency plan, we reviewed it. It met our regulations, but our regulations at that time weren't as mature as they would be after this spill. So these were the lessons learned. The prevention measures, if the prevention measures are in place today were in place in '89, that never would have happened. Ed is right. The prevention measures in Prince William Sound are very sophisticated, and I'm not going to dwell on that. The response capacity in the plan was simply inadequate. The implementation of the plan, the initial response to contain control and remove the drilling oil during the most opportune 72-hour window, optimal conditions, simply failed, and the deployment of out-of-state resources to get here in time to do anything about it just can't happen. So the failure to stop it from happening and the inability to contain or to control it resulted then in the distribution of oil over hundreds of miles, ultimately ended up in shoreline impacts and a 3-year program which was very hardly worked, very rigorously worked, and highly contentious, by the way, and all about shoreline cleanup prioritization, shoreline cleanup methodologies, and shoreline cleanup endpoints, and some of which is still being debated today. This is the map that's showing the oiling. On day 4 after the storm, the distance from the vessel about doubled. It went from about 16 miles to about 35 or 40 miles. And then after that, the currents got it in. The key point at the 72 hours from the state's view, it went from an offense to defense. In the first 3 days, offensively, if you could get on that, and if you could do it with the gear that's in place today, you could have truly knocked that down to a great extent. Once it gets beyond that, this response strategy, you're really in a defensive mode. You're chasing oil at that point. You're doing what you can to protect shorelines. So what happened as a result of that? Well, the state said we're never going to get stuck again without an ability to respond. And so the debate came over, so how much you got to have, right? Well, the state issued an emergency order on April 7th, which was the first attempt then, after the contingency plan regulations, to establish what I would say is now referred to as a response planning standard. And they put that into emergency order and give it to LES that you either have to comply with this or the terminal will be shut down. So there's a very short time frame to comply with the terms of the emergency order. Following the emergency order then, the state passed House Bill 567, which put into statute then the response planning standard of 300,000 barrels, contain, control, remove in 72 hours. And that was based on the Exxon model of having a 72-hour window of opportunity to get that oil that was missed. And that became the standard. And there was a very serious debate about whether it should be 300,000 barrels or 1 million barrels, because 300,000 barrels is not a full boat. And so there was an extensive debate about that. And it had ended up, and so even though the 300,000 barrels is a substantial standard, it's still not the full boat level that a lot of people argued they wanted. The OPA passed following that in August, and I believe that's the only response planning standard that's in OPA is the state response planning standard of 300,000 barrels in 72 hours. So it was federalized and put in federal statutes too. State also created the Alaska Oil Spill Commission, which generated 58 different recommendations. Okay. So I will just close then by saying prevention now is totally different. We've got best available technology, 11 tugs, 2 escorts, double hull tanker fleet, speed limits, alcohol, yada, yada, yada. It's a very sophisticated system. The state emergency order resulted in the issuance of, or the creation of the ship escort response vessel system. Alaska responded to the state emergency order by creating essentially a spill co-op, if you will, in Osro to deal with the new requirements. So the ship escort vessel response system was started in '89. The regional citizens advisory committees kicked in, and the thing has been developed and matured from here. I also had the Overseas Ohio. Ed showed about that. And preparedness now is night and day. In '89, there was 13 skimmers, 5 miles of boom, 2,475 gallons of dispersant, no fire boom or igniters, and one 12,000 barrel storage barge which is out of service. And you can read the list here of gear that's in place now in terms of offshore and nearshore recovery systems. There's four different systems. We have a nearshore recovery system with 54 mini barges. There's fishermen, 400 fishing vessels under contract with 1,500 participants, 5 hatchery protection sites, 71 miles of selected boom, 3,600 feet of fire boom, 75,000 gallons of dispersant, 5 response centers, extensive training drills, inspections, and a rigorous 5-year review, update, and renewal of the oil spill contingency plan with public review and oversight by the Regional Citizens Advisory Council. Thank you. Thank you, Larry.
Good morning, everyone. After Dave's opening remarks about trying to find warm bodies who actually were on the Valdez spill, I'm really glad to be here. And Ed Page reminded me that I was a racquetball partner with Dave, too, and I used to get beat up pretty badly. And one night I wound up in the emergency room in Anchorage Hospital. He remembers, too.
Relations with industry.
As you probably can tell, I've been retired for about 15 years, so I haven't even thought about the Valdez oil spill in a long, long time, and I haven't been involved in any kind of industry activities, consulting whatsoever. I went retired, I went cold turkey. So I couldn't find a suit that fit, I couldn't find a tie I liked, and I haven't done a PowerPoint presentation in years. So this is going to be a pretty informal talk about the cleanup itself. I'm not going to talk about prevention. I wasn't involved in that. And I went up there after the initial response. I arrived in Alaska about 3 weeks after the spill and got thrown into the shoreline cleanup. And that was the focus of my activities. My 3-month assignment lasted for 2.5 years. So it was a pretty overwhelming experience when I first went out on the shorelines. And I remember walking on the shores of Smith Island, Latouche Island, Knight Island, being ankle deep in oil and thinking, oh my God, are we ever going to be able to finish this up? But we did. So let me try to give you an overview of how the cleanup went. As you've seen from the maps that people have shown, the cleanup operations were conducted over an area of thousands of square miles in a very remote and hostile marine environment. For those of you who have never been to Alaska, in that part of Alaska, it's immense. If you've been to the Grand Canyon, multiply that by about 1,000 times. It is just an unbelievable piece of geography. The cleanup operations in '89 covered over 1,000 miles of shoreline. The only access was by boat, float plane, or helicopter. That was the only way in and out. The spill response was headquartered in Valdez with satellite operations in the remote affected communities, Cordova, Kodiak, Seward, Homer. We had set up satellite offices in those communities, so we had communications with the local residents and especially the fishermen. And one of the other duties I had as the technical manager for Exxon during the spill was the interface with the fishermen. As you've heard earlier, the cleanup technologies used shortly after the spill were burning, which was limited, dispersants, which were limited, and then once that storm hit 3 days after the spill, it was a new ball game. The various, let me talk a little bit about the shoreline cleanup approval process. That was touched on by Ed Page. This was a really important part of the spill cleanup. An interagency shoreline cleanup committee was formed. And this committee was composed of the U.S. Coast Guard, NOAA, ADEC, the landowners, and Exxon. So there was a voice from all the stakeholders. The committee, through survey teams, surveyed 3,400 miles of shoreline, an enormous amount of shoreline. 1,300 miles were found to be impacted to some degree. And you've seen some of the maps showing the oiling. Well, the oiling wasn't all heavy. It varied from heavy within Prince William Sound to medium and then to light and very light, depending on how far from the spill and where the tides and the currents took the oil. Shoreline assessment teams were sent out to each segment to determine the degree of oiling. These 1,300 miles of shoreline were broken down into manageable segments, and then the teams went out to look at the ecosystem on the shoreline and to see what cleanup techniques might be applicable and if there were any native artifacts that might have been on those shorelines. Many of these shorelines hadn't been visited for 100 years, 200 years, who knows how long. The native cultural items, if they were found, were removed and cataloged by a trained archaeologist. And there's a report about that thick that was issued in 1991 on the cataloging of native cultural items. I think there were about 271 new sites that were discovered during the cleanup. Shoreline cleanup decisions and priorities were discussed by this committee and guided by the concept of net environmental benefit, which Ed Page talked about, and that is really key to the whole cleanup process. And then the committee had to prove the cleanup technique that was applied to each segment of shoreline. And in fact, some areas were left alone. The committee decided that there would be more harm than good from going onto those shorelines and using intrusive technologies, and that nature would take care of most of the cleanup. Let me talk a little bit about the cleanup technology used on the shorelines and intertidal zones. And maybe I could have some of the slides.
Do you want to do that? You want me to try?
Maybe you could do that for me, Dave.
Let's see how that works.
It's over there.
It's over
Yeah, sorry, this is old technology.
It's a slide.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we use manual cleanup. We took a lot of heat in some of the press for showing people with rags, washing rocks. Well, there wasn't much of an alternative in many cases. So you had to, deal with the situation as best you could, and there was a lot of manual cleanup that went on. The next slide shows some tilling. Put the next one on, Dave? Or what was it? Go, keep going. Yeah, okay. Tilling was one of the other techniques that was used, bringing machinery on shore, turning over the sediments and exposing the oil, and then picking the oil up either manually or then using water washing to go after it. And then another technique that was used was storm berm relocation. You see some heavy-duty machinery in there. The storm berms in this part of Alaska were unbelievable. I mean, these were logs that were 3 and 4 feet thick, piled up like pickup sticks at the top end of the intertidal zone. And if oil had accumulated on them, the only way to get at the oil was to disturb the storm berms and then get at the oil and then try to remove it. Moving on, I'll show you a picture of some of the equipment staging in Valdez. The people that mentioned earlier, there were up to 12,000 workers employed at the height of the cleanup in 1991, and they all needed equipment. They needed to be fed. They needed to be housed. It was just a massive logistics operation. The next slide shows some of the barges that we brought in from the lower 48. These were landing craft vehicles. I think we had 70 of them at the peak in order to get out to the shorelines and then deploy the workers and the equipment. The next slide shows a floating hotel. Where do you put all these people? So we had to build barges and brought in trailers from the North Slope, mounted them on the barges, and this became housing for the workers out in the shoreline. Then we didn't have to transport people back and forth. Again, we're talking hundreds of miles in very, very rough weather conditions quite often. Another thing that we used that I remembered was we actually leased a Navy destroyer, the USS Juneau, and the USS Juneau housed about 400 workers. Moving on to the next slide, it shows you some of the cold water flushing that was done. This was cold water that was supplied from pumps on the barges and then was used extensively where the oil could be mobilized with cold water. And then the next slide shows a six-pack, which was, that's a boiler. And those boilers were used to heat the seawater up to 140 degrees, transport it to shore, and then use it to hose down the shorelines and try to mobilize the oil down to the shoreline and then have it contained by booms and then picked up by skimmers. And then a couple of slides showing the warm water flushing. That was an offshore barge doing it with technology that was adapted from the cement industry and brought up to Alaska from the lower 48. And then there's another slide of hot water washing a cliff that was inaccessible from people working on the shoreline. And just a couple of before and after slides. The first slide is one of Smith Island, which was heavily oiled. That was 1989, and then the next slide shows Smith Island in 1991. And then there's another similar set of slides for Green Island, very heavily oiled, and then in 1991. Then moving on to another technology, bioremediation, fairly straightforward. It's the application of fertilizer to the shorelines to expedite the role of bacteria in degrading the oil. And we use two types of fertilizers. One was a solid fertilizer like you'd use on your lawn, a granular fertilizer. Another was a liquid fertilizer called Inapol, which was made in France by Alpha Aquitaine, I believe. and it was an oleophilic fertilizer which clings to the rocks, and that was very effective. And so it sped up the bacterial process. The EPA did the testing to demonstrate the technology. We got approval to use it in late 1989, used it again in 1990 and 1991. And here are a couple of slides of another place on Green Island. Well, that's a shot of people applying the Inipol. And then moving to the next slide, that was a test patch that the EPA conducted, before and after. The before is on the right, after on the left. Let's go next slide. And that's Green Island before bioremediation, and then Green Island following bioremediation. So with bioremediation turned out to be a very effective tool, and it wasn't that intrusive. One of the things I might mention is we got loads of proposals from people all over the world for various technologies to apply to Alaska. I had boxes of bacteria under my desk from Russia, Germany, Italy, you name it, I had it. But there was no need to bring in foreign bacteria. There was native bacteria there to take care of the oil. And I'm sure we never would have got approval for bacteria from Russia. So those were the technologies that we actually used. Another one I might mention, people talked about the salmon fishery. We actually did some salmon fishing, or the fishermen actually did some fishing in Prince William Sound in 1989. We had to develop a kelp washer. There's a certain type of kelp called popweed. It has air bubbles, and it floats. Well, unfortunately, when the popweed was released from the shoreline, it's oily, it floats into Prince William Sound. And then if it gets into the fishermen's nets, the fish are contaminated, and the fish have to be disposed of. So we developed a barge system with a weed conveyor that we got somewhere in Florida to pick up popweed, wash it, contain the dirty water, and contain the popweed, and the fishermen actually went out, and I think they got over 20 million salmon that year. The fishery was closed because of a scare of oil. It turned out to be diesel oil and bilge oil, but that ended the fishery for 1989. One of the other technologies that we did not deploy, we were under a lot of pressure to remove all the oil. People have talked about that. How clean is clean? What is the net environmental benefit? Well, there were a lot of people that wanted the oil completely removed. There was pressure to build a rock washer. This was basically a barge-mounted device, like a huge cement kiln, that would take boulders and sediments extracted from the beaches offshore, wash it, and then return it to the shore. It basically a big mining operation. I had a team of engineers that designed the rock washer. We built it in the lower 48. It was on barges ready to ship to Alaska. And then at the 11th hour, it was decided that there was no net environmental benefit to mining the beaches. So the rock washer was dismantled. Let me mention a few things that talk about lessons learned and disappointments. One of the disappointments from the Exxon side is that we were unable to use dispersants for cleaning up the shoreline. We did a test, I believe it was on Ingot Island. The test results we thought were successful. We had toxicity testing in hand, but we couldn't get approval. If we'd been able to use the dispersants, it was our opinion that we would have been able to release more of the oil, collect more of the oil, and there would have been fewer after effects. Skimming technology, it was touched on earlier. Skimming technology was not very effective. I think skimmers were 10, 20% effective at picking up the oil, something in that league. And I don't know what the status is today if skimming technology has improved that much. but that was a shortcoming. And during the spill, we generated an enormous amount of solid waste, oily booms, oily absorbent materials, rags, gloves, you name it. We had designed 2 state-of-the-art incinerators that were mounted on barges to incinerate all this oily debris. The incinerators met state and federal requirements, but we couldn't get approval at the last minute. So we wound up shipping about 50,000 tons of solid waste to a hazardous waste landfill in Oregon. And we think the better method would have been to incinerate the material, at the source. Lessons learned, some of them were already touched on by Ed Page. The cleanup equipment must be immediately available. That was not the case in the Valdez spill, and we've seen the consequences of that. An assortment of cleanup technologies has to be pre-approved. You can't rely on 1 technology, 2 technologies, 3. Anything that's available needs to be evaluated and pre-approved for the area that's under consideration. The sensitive areas for immediate protection need to be prioritized. I went on a number of oil spill drills after the Alaska cleanup was over. Until from about 1991 to about 1995, we had oil spill drills in different parts of the United States. I don't know if they're still continuing those, but they were very valuable in doing a simulated oil spill and identifying, sensitive environmental areas, and then saying, here's where we're going to deploy boom, here's where we're going to deploy skimmers, here's where we're going to deploy this type of technology, and getting on that right away. The decision-making process needs to be clearly spelled out before an oil spill. You can't muddle around once the oil is on the water. You've got to make your decisions right away, or the situation can get much worse. Net environmental benefit, everybody has to have a clear understanding of that, and I think the rock washer was a good example of where we almost went too far with net environmental benefit in trying to remove all the oil. And then frequent and thorough communications with all vested interests. We did our best to communicate with the native communities. We had people actually billeted in the native communities around Prince William Sound. We had people in the fishing communities, and it would have been much more difficult to conduct the cleanup if we didn't have people in the satellite offices spread around Prince William Sound and the Kenai Peninsula. And then the last one is periodic training for key personnel. You got to have people who are up to date on technology, up to date on, the areas that are subject to heavy tanker traffic, et cetera. So I think that's about it, Dave.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Appreciate it.